right, we're going to talk about something that people don't talk about a lot, and that is the adornment of books and paper marbling. And my guest is Elizabeth Frengel, who is a curator of rare books at the University of Chicago. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
How do you become a curator of rare books?
I really fell into it. I started my career as a journalist, and I worked
TV or print?
Print.
Okay.
Print journalism. I worked for Kiplinger Personal Finance for many years in Washington, D.C., and I went to graduate school and I studied English literature. And while I was doing that, I was working in a library, and I thought about libraries as a possible career path, and I volunteered at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in in their rare book library, and it became something that was of great interest to me, and I got a library degree and started working in a rare book library, and I haven't looked back at journalism ever since.
You found your thing,
I
right?
did. Yeah.
So when I asked you to come on, I don't know anything about paper marbling, and the Beinecke Library at Yale is doing a whole series on this, and you've brought in a collection of books. And for those who don't know about marbling, I mean, many times, which goes back to what, the 1600s or so, inside a book you would have this, which is an adornment of books. So let's talk about some of the books that you have brought in and some of the marbling, even on the edges of pages.
Yeah. You have this really lovely edge marbling, which is more uncommon than marbled end papers, which is probably one of the most common adornments of rare books and manuscripts.
When did it start, as far back as we know?
Yeah, the earliest surviving specimens of marbled paper date from the 12th century, and we think it originated in Japan, although we know there was paper marbling going on in Persia and in Turkey, and it traveled to Europe over the Silk Road, and there were students and scholars who would travel to the Near East, and we know that they brought back samples of marbled paper, and it wasn't long before marbling guilds were established in Germany and in France.
And how did it start? Just to adorn a book, or was it just for certain books that these end papers would be so beautiful?
It started really as a way to decorate papers and textiles, and they weren't necessarily applied to books. Marbled papers were used to line chests of drawers. They were used on the backs of playing cards. They were used as a way to counteract counterfeiting of currency. So early American money was marbled, and that was a way of staving off counterfeiting.
Let's go through some of the pictures that we have about marbling. Now, it goes back, so in book binding, you would put the end papers on last? How did this work out, the whole printing?
Yeah, the binding does go on last, and generally end papers, I mean, it really depends upon the period in which the book is manufactured, but generally the binding is stitched, or in some of these books that we have here, they're case bound, so the end papers would be like a protective wrap around the text block.
And would you
protect it from?
Would you apprentice to do this? I mean, how would you start to do this paper marbling? Because it doesn't happen in 1 second.
No, and it looks like it could be easy, but in fact it's a really complicated art, and there was a lot of, your question is a good one, because there was a lot of secrecy about the process and the technique of marbling, and that's because when the guilds were formed and paper marbling was established in Europe, the guilds really wanted to keep the techniques to themselves, and they wanted to keep them out of the hands of book binders and booksellers, so that they would always have a ready market for their papers to decorate them. There was really no professional literature that was published on marbling until the early 19th century.
Wow. So I mean, in my naivete, I would think water and oils and colors, and were certain colors prevalent to certain countries?
Yeah. That's a really good question, because there are certain styles of marbling that are easily recognizable once you start looking at it. It's an art that's readily overlooked because you see it on the insides of book covers and you can easily pass by it. But when you really start looking at it and examining it, certain patterns tend to have certain colors in them. And that comes from the recipes when finally the techniques were written down and published that were followed. So for example, Spanish shell marbling will usually have a backdrop that's predominantly slate gray or blue.
Let's go through the pictures now because we can show folks. So a Turkish flower. Tell me about this.
Yes, so this is a particular kind of marbling that we think originated in Turkey. And the background, you'll see a really delicate marbled pattern. And paper marbling, if you think about it, it was invented or created, it really seeks to emulate the natural the veins of the polished stone of natural marbling. So in this Ebru style, that's what we would call this, you see a really delicate marbled pattern in the background, and then there's a flower that's drawn from droplets of paint that are dropped onto the surface of the marbling bath. And it's complicated. It's not an easy art to master.
And I would think no two flowers are the same, right? Because it's water and it's paint and it's...
Yeah, you would think that, although master paper marblers can recreate the exact same pattern in successive baths and on successive sheets of paper. Hard to do.
Yeah, I wouldn't even try it. This would be from what country, can you tell?
Well, I happen to know where that specimen came from because that's part of the exhibition. That was marbled by Richard J. Wolfe, who was an historian of marbling. He died in 2017, but he really wrote the modern history of marbling, which is hard to do because the origins of it are uncertain. And he, one of the things he set out for himself to do in order to understand the history of it, he said, I have to figure out how to marble myself. And he became a master paper marbler. So this is a Dutch pattern, very common. It's got the flourishes that look like a little bouquet or a peacock's tail. And he did this for one of his books.
It's interesting that you talk about the secrecy behind this. So they would, did people know what was going on in a certain building in a town, or they didn't even know where that was happening?
That wasn't so much secret as, you know, the process, and you have, in a paper marbling workshop, you have many people working at different parts of the process. So some of them are grinding the pigments, some of them are creating the size. Size is a water that's been thickened with carrageenan, a seaweed byproduct, so it has some tension, so that when you drop the pigments onto the surface of the bath, they'll float, and then you can comb them or draw them into
I feel like I need to take a class, Elizabeth. Yes. All right, the origins of this one?
That's a Spanish pattern, and you can see the slate blue in the background. That's one of my favorites, and it might be hard to see it, but it looks like it has some dimension in it, almost like wrinkles, and that's created by gently shifting the paper back and forth as you draw it through the bath to give it this fanned or wrinkled appearance, and it gives it depth. It's really beautiful. It's one of my favorite patterns. That's a shell pattern.
Of course it is. Dating back to, do we know?
I think that was done in the 20th century. I think that's one of Richard J. Wolfe's marbled papers. Yeah. But it's a classic style. That is quintessentially French, and that's called the French snail or French curl pattern. And the French loved this. They used it a lot in the 18th century. And then the Germans took that pattern and developed it further, and it kind of dropped out of fashion. But you see books that were printed and bound in the 18th century, that's a very common pattern. And that particular marbled paper is on the inside of one of the volumes of Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie that takes you into a marbler's workshop in the 18th century.
It's just stunning. It really is.
That's a very modern, that's a modern pattern that is kind of a freestyle improvisation on classical patterns. That was done by, it's included in a book that was done by Claudia Cohen and Barbara Hodgson. And Claudia Cohen is a book binder and Barbara Hodgson is a book designer. And that was published, I think, in 2017 or 2016.
It looks more modern.
It does, yeah, and it's meant to. That was done by Richard J. Wolfe, and that's a variation on the Dutch pattern.
I see.
And that was also done by him, and you can see that's a blend of two patterns. It's like the classic Turkish pattern with the little swirls that are like the French snail. or French curl.
How are the pigments? Where does the paint come from? You said it was, is this a ground up pigment?
Yeah, well, the pigments come from a variety of sources, a lot of times natural minerals, and they're ground and then thickened with some kind of binder. Often it's like a fish glue that thickens it. And you can marble today with acrylic paints, with watercolor, or with oil paints. Don't know exactly how that was done.
More modern?
No, that's actually more classical.
You don't want me to be a curator of rare books.
You're actually doing very well. I think that was done in the 19th century, and that is a classic Turkish style. And you can see there, it almost looks, when you look at it, it almost looks like the veins of the polished stone.
It's beautiful. All of these works are. And there we have the Vermont marble that is at the Beinecke Rare Library at Yale.
Yeah, and I think the library is such an extraordinary place. It really, the walls of the library are made of these panels, 8 feet by 8 feet of Vermont marble, and it's thin enough or just thick enough to allow light to pass through it.
Stunning.
And it gave me the idea for this exhibition because, as I said, it's one of the most commonly applied decorations for rare books and manuscripts, and the library itself houses all these beautiful rare books and manuscripts, and I thought it was apt.
Because this is a lost art for many ways, although it's still taught today in some places, what do you want people to know about books and this type of art that we don't know about?
Well, I think because it's generally the papers the marble papers are used as end papers and they're hidden beneath the covers of books, they're often overlooked. And I think the art of marbling is often overlooked as an art. So I think the main thing I would like people to take away from the exhibition is that marbling is art worth further consideration.
I just want to look through. So
that's a paste paper pattern, and that's the technique is similar to marbling, but it varies in the way that the paste is like the pigment's a starchy kind of consistency.
To me, this is so beautiful, and probably when it was done, maybe people even then looked past that. I'll never do that again.
Right.
And you could also see some kind of a pattern here on the pages.
Yeah, that's edge marbling, and that's something the marbling's still practiced today, and it's something that, because the literature is not very specific on how to do this, we've had to really reverse engineer how was this done. How do you marble the edges of a text block?
Now this is a book, I can't even read the title, but it's also got some gold flecking on the spine of the book.
Right, and it's got these beautiful shell marbled covers.
They're just stunning to me. These are what, from what year? 18?
Yeah, 18. Well, I would say the 18th century was really the peak of the use of decorated papers as end papers in books. So you see a lot that this is the heyday of.
I wonder if they took this for granted back in the day, because so many books had this, and they didn't. They were like, oh, you know, here's another pattern.
Well, I do know that Benjamin Franklin was very particular about the marbled papers that he would include in the books that he published, and he had a special order going with a supplier in France. And then when the American Revolution got underway, his supply was disrupted. So it's something to consider. I don't know that he took it for granted.
Makes a great story, though. Where around the country, around the world, does this still go on? Yeah, well, in
New England, I tried paper marbling myself for the first time at the Creative Arts Workshop here in New Haven, and there are 2 master paper marblers in Massachusetts, and that's Dan and Regina St. John, and they have Chain of River marblers, and they give workshops. They travel around. They also host people to marble in their studio in Massachusetts. So you can find studios. In Chicago, I found a Turkish paper marbler who gave classes in the traditional Ebru style, and tried that for the first time when I moved to Chicago. So, so it's still happening. I think that marbling is experiencing a little bit of a renaissance right now, because it is this beautiful, tactile, wonderful art to practice, but also to appreciate in this digital sort of, you know,
where you're actually doing
world.
something with your hands.
Yeah.
So what is the application now for this in modern times? Maybe we see it on shirts.
Yeah.
Maybe we see it. Where is the application?
You do see marbled textiles, scarves, ties, even dresses. I've seen those that are marbled and quite beautiful. They're still applied as book papers. I do think that in publishing, in contemporary publishing, there's an interest in making, because there's the competition with electronic versions of books, those that are produced in the physical iteration, there's more attention being paid to the materials and the decoration of them to make them nicer, to make them more worth hanging on to.
And they say books aren't important.
Yeah, I think they're more important than ever.
I never reply to that.
Yeah.
As a curator of rare books, what finds have you come across that have just been sort of your eureka moments?
Yeah, well, you had a photograph of it, the Claudia Cohen and Barbara Hodgson decorating paper. It's a modern book that was published just a few years ago in a very limited number, but it's an amazing 2-volume set of just a collection of all these. Some of them are vintage papers and some are papers that they made themselves and included in the volume, so that was really great. After I had done the research while I was doing the research for this exhibition, I relied a lot upon the work of the historian Richard J. Wolff, and he died in 2017, and not too long ago I got a phone call at the University of Chicago from his daughter offering his archive. So not just it was his collection of books, the papers that he marbled, also the decorated papers that he collected, and his research files. So we decided that we're going to acquire that very
wow,
soon.
that's exciting.
Yeah.
Do you go to sleep at night thinking about rare books? I mean,
I am always thinking about rare books.
Outside of the marbling, are there other things that you have found that you want the world to know about when it comes to rare books?
Yeah, I think that there are so many things to discover when you have the material object in front of you. Sometimes you'll see an inscription that might get you thinking about the previous owner, or the size of a book, like something like this. Its format suggests that this was portable, and perhaps a book that you could take with you. So perhaps the publisher or the binder of this book had a particular audience in mind for how it would be used. I think the material objects and the material details tell us a lot about whom the book was for, how it could have been used, and what it might have meant to him or her.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your knowledge. I will never look at a book the same way again. I'm just going to go through something that I see old and look for the end papers.
Okay.
Thank you for your knowledge, and thank you for what you're doing for books.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.
Spend all night kissing and the bumper's right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked if I'm so wishing I found the keys to the door, but it's also a metaphor. Need to keep locked in the grocery store, but mine just to save time. I'll skip right ahead to the nice ride.